Yes, so we are live on YouTube. So is it okay if I start now?
Just give me 1 second.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, you can start.
Perfect. So hi everyone, thank you for joining us for the 11th session of the FRO Virtual Summit. The topic of the session is legal framework for franchising in India. And as our esteemed panelist for this session is Mr. Shivendra Kundra. He is the founding partner at Kundra and Bansal. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Shivendra.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. So when this topic was given to me, I was trying to figure out as to how I should really approach it, considering that many of you would already know that there is not one single statute that governs franchising in India. That said, there is a plethora of laws which impact the franchising industry as they impact every other industry. And this is true not only just for India, but even in countries which have more advanced laws with regard to franchising, say the United States of America. It really boils down eventually to the franchising agreement that the parties sign amongst themselves. I thought that the best way of going about it is actually to split it in parts. And if you were to look at the franchising relationship between the parties, you could really classify it into 4 categories. One is pre-negotiation, when you actually start looking at each other, that is the franchisor and the franchisee start looking at each other, trying to forge a relationship. That's the time that you do your due diligence. In the United States, for example, there are laws that protect the franchisee, particularly as the franchisor is to do certain disclosures. But I see no reason why that should serve as an impediment in India. The same disclosures can be made in India as well, in the contract and even through due diligence. In fact, in some of the agreements that we've done, we've incorporated some of the elements of the Federal Trade Commission's rule regarding franchising disclosures. Now, that's the first part, that is the due diligence part. The second is the negotiation part, where you actually get down to sizing each other up and deciding as to what you will have in your contract. The third aspect, or the third part, is the actual relationship of the parties once the contract is signed, and that is governed by the contract. And the fourth, which is equally important, but sometimes we tend to overlook it, is what happens after the contract expires or is terminated. So these are the 4 parts to it. Now, I'm going to start and I'm going to go, I don't have much time to start about 20 minutes. I've already, I think, spoken for about 3 or 4 minutes. So the first part is, which is, dealing with your actual due diligence. What is it that you really need to know about the franchisor? Or what is it that you need to know about the franchisee if you're a franchisor? So first of all, you should know as to what the franchisor is in terms of its constitution. Is it a company? Is it a proprietary concern? Is it a partnership? What sort of antecedents each party has? Has it been involved in any litigation? Any of the constituents, any of the principal owners have been involved in any litigation, any bankruptcy issues, and and so on and so forth, so that you basically get to know a little bit about each other. You also need to know what is going to be your estimated initial expense, what is going to be the trademark arrangement. in terms of licensing, is the franchisor actually a proprietor of the trademark, or is he a licensee? Well, at least that he should be a licensee, if not the proprietor. Now, since we are on the subject of trademarks, I think it's important to give a little bit of time to this. And I'm now going to go into the second, or the third, I'm going to jump to the third part, because negotiation is not something that we need to discuss here. The third part is just to what actually should be incorporated in the agreement. So if you look at trademarks, that is perhaps the most key constituent of a trademark, of a franchising relationship. That forms the basis of the relationship between the parties. From a franchisor's perspective, it is important, of course, to ensure that the franchisee protects the brand name, the trade name, the marks, the intellectual property of the franchisor. From the franchisee's perspective, it is equally important to know that the franchisor holds a valid, has valid ownership of the marks, or has a valid license, which allows him to sub-license these marks. Now, therefore, it needs to be adequately built into the agreement that the marks are of the franchisor, and you need to do a due diligence. You need to have adequate protection in terms of the agreement, that if the marks are found not to be in the ownership or under the license, or under a license, then what are your remedies as a franchisee? Similarly, as a franchisor, you need to make sure that if there is any violation of your trademarks or other intellectual property by the franchisor, or by the franchisee, sorry, or by any other third party, then what is the protection that is available to you in terms of the agreement? Then the second very important aspect, particularly in relation to cross-border franchising, is royalty payments. In the current context, perhaps it doesn't assume so much of significance as it used to in the past, because in the 90s, up until the late 90s, there used to be restrictions on the quantum of royalty payments which are to be made from India. That restriction is no longer there, although strangely enough, there had been talk for 2 consecutive years, or last year and the year before, about how certain restrictions on royalty payments from India should be brought back. But this is in the context of cross-border franchising, but some of you at least, it will have its significance, particularly when you're thinking in terms of cross-border franchising, or taking a franchise from overseas, or giving out your franchise. But of course, when you're giving out a franchise, these regulations will not apply. They're mainly in relation to payments from India. Equally, what I have noticed is that some of the franchisors are very keen that their payments should be guaranteed. Now, there was some trouble here because earlier the Reserve Bank of India, to this day, the Reserve Bank of India doesn't straight away allow you to guarantee payments of royalties as an Indian resident. Therefore, you need to go to the Reserve Bank of India and get those permissions. That sometimes becomes necessary to assuage the fears of the franchisor that resides overseas. So, trademarks, payments, I've dealt with. I'll now go to the question of territory. Now, territory, there is no specific law that deals with how you deal with territory in your agreement. It is a matter of negotiation between the parties. But I think it is important to understand that once it is incorporated in the agreement, you will be bound by it. So territory is not just in terms of an area. I think what is equally important to remember is territory is also in terms of where you can operate from, or out of where you can operate. So for example, if you're talking about a franchise, say in relation to a product sold in retail, then is it only the stores uh, that the franchisor allows the franchisee to operate from? Because I've seen cases where, and I've had sort of two separate situations where in one case, the franchisee was only allowed to operate out of stores. And in another case, the franchisee was allowed to operate out of stores, temporary location, kiosks. In some cases, the franchisor may want to have special control over special locations, such as airports, uh, railway stations, etc. So there again, you need to be mindful of as to what is territory. And as I said, territory is not just uh, confined to an area of a state, but also in terms of where you're operating and where you're selling from. Uh, Also, another important aspect is in relation to exclusivity, whether you have exclusivity with regard to the territory or you don't. And I think you should be mindful of what your aspirations are and accordingly negotiate when it comes to the language of the contract with regard to territory. Do you have a right to sub-franchise? That again is something that needs to be dealt with. Term, how long is the agreement for? Typically, franchising agreements have a longer duration than some of the other agreements would because of the longs, because of the gestation period, etc. What is going to be the when it comes to payments? Is there an initial franchise fee aside from royalty? If there is, and generally there is, then that should be clearly defined. Are there any development obligations from for the franchisee? If there are any development obligations, then what are the consequences? What are the mitigating factors? For example, in the current context, in the COVID, uh, we, are, we are impacted by COVID. A lot of development schedules have been thrown out of gear. Is there adequate protection in terms of the agreement to protect you against such situations? Is it part of force majeure or not? I mean, these again, for force majeure clauses have become extremely relevant in the current times. Site selection. Does the franchisor have a right over site selection? Does the franchisee have a right to relocate if for some reason the business is not doing as expected from a particular location, or if it faces some other problems, which could be legal issues or other statutory issues? What about data privacy? Who owns the data? What are the safeguards in terms of data protection in the agreement, and what are the safeguards that particularly the franchisee is taking in terms of data protection? Who owns the data? Who owns the database? These are all questions that need to be dealt with in the agreement. Supplies. Now, interestingly, if you are, for example, as many franchising agreements would provide, that you need to procure your inputs or your material from a particular supplier. The question that arises is it in conflict with the Competition Act of India? There is a chapter within the Competition Act, which is Chapter 2, which deals with anti-competitive agreements. And but essentially it says that you can't have any agreement which is in relation to supply as well, or which is in relation to supply, since I'm talking about supplies here, which has the adverse effect on competition in India. Now, this has been tested in courts as well, but by and large, it can be said that if you are in a franchise relationship, then it would be fair to say that you would have certain restrictions in the franchise agreement. And how you draft those provisions will decide whether you are clearly within the ambit of anti-competitive agreements or not. Some of the other issues that will arise is with regard to labor laws, for example, working hours. That impacts not just the franchisee, but the franchisor as well. Because if the franchisee's business is impacted, then the franchisor is also impacted. You get bad press. We've had cases, and I'm not talking about, we've had cases, and I'm not just talking about labor laws, but even under the Consumer Protection Act, where consumers have sued the franchisor as well, even though the franchisor may have no direct relationship in terms of operations with the consumers. Talking about consumer protection laws, be mindful that as a franchisee, you will not get protection under the Consumer Protection Act because you are not a consumer as defined under the Consumer Protection Act. There are other issues which are in relation to transfer, what happens to the relationship when there is a transfer of ownership of the franchisee or the franchisor. Does the agreement adequately take that into consideration? What happens in case of default? What happens is there? What about compensation? Compensation in terms has to be provided in terms of the contract, but is governed by the provisions of the Contract Act. So you have to be mindful as to how you draft your compensation provisions, whether they will pass muster in terms of being applicable in terms of the law or not. Also, choice of law. What law, if it's a cross-border agreement, if it's a cross-border arrangement, then what is the law that the agreement is going to be governed by? Is there an arbitration clause? Generally, in franchising agreements, we recommend arbitration clauses these days. If there is an arbitration clause, then where is the seat of arbitration? Is it in India or is it overseas? If it is overseas, then the award, any challenge to the award can only be done there. You should be mindful of that. That if you are entering into an arbitration agreement as a franchisee, where your franchisor insists that, let's say, that arbitration will take place in Singapore or in the US, then you cannot challenge the award in India, except on very limited grounds, which is against public policy. But the challenge will have to be made there. But you can seek interim relief in India, which is that if there is anything that you claim in terms of your relationship in India, you can approach a court of law without going to the arbitrator. So, how much time do we have?
We have actually crossed the time allotted to us, but
okay.
Yeah, if you want to share any last points, please.
No, I think I've, because it was 20 minutes, so I've tried to cover as much as I could in terms of the provisions. What I just wanted to conclude by saying that, the legal framework in India is such where you may not have a specific law dealing with franchising, such as say insurance or aviation. But that said, there is adequate protection that is available to both the franchisor and the franchisee in terms of various statutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shivendra, for such an informative session. It was absolutely wonderful having you with us, and thank you for your great insights. Anything you would like to say in the end before we just wrap up the session?
I just want to thank everyone, whoever was tuned in. I want to thank the audience for taking part and giving me an opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you. Are there any questions that? Uh,
No, so we are not taking up questions because
okay.
we have crossed the time limit. But yeah,
Okay.
it was wonderful having you, and thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Shivesh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.